Where did you steal that diary? Ethan Carlyle's voice cracked across the marble reading hall, loud enough to silence every turning page. Dozens of heads snapped toward the circulation desk where Naomi Brooks, a black librarian in a neatly pressed navy cardigan, stood perfectly still with an old leather journal resting gently between her hands. Afternoon sunlight spilled through the towering windows, catching tiny flecks of dust that floated in the heavy silence. The soft hum of the climate system suddenly felt deafening. Ethan strode forward, polished Italian shoes striking the stone floor with sharp, echoing clicks. His expensive charcoal coat swayed behind him as his hand shot out and snatched the diary before Naomi could answer. Several patrons exchanged uneasy glances. A little boy clutched his mother's sleeve. Even the security guard hesitated. Ethan stared at the cracked leather cover as though it had crawled out of a grave. His breathing shortened. His jaw tightened. Then anger buried whatever fear had flashed across his face. "People like you always think everything belongs to them," he said coldly. "Do you have any idea what this is worth?" Naomi met his eyes without raising her voice. "More than money." He laughed once, bitter and hollow. "You expect me to believe that?" The sound bounced off rows of oak bookshelves lined with thousands of forgotten stories. Naomi did not move. Her hands folded quietly in front of her. "I never asked you to believe me." Ethan's assistant hurried toward him, whispering that the board meeting could not wait another minute. Ethan ignored him completely. Every muscle in his body remained locked on the diary. Naomi noticed a faint tremble in his fingers. She noticed the tiny scar near his wedding ring. She noticed the way he refused to blink. None of it surprised her. She had imagined this moment for years. Across the room, an elderly volunteer slowly lowered a cart of returned books, sensing something impossible was unfolding. The old clock above the reference desk ticked with painful precision. Tick. 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 Ethan flipped the diary over, searching for a name, a library barcode, anything that could explain why it had suddenly appeared after so many years. There was nothing except faded leather worn smooth by countless hands. "Who gave this to you?" he demanded. Naomi inhaled slowly, hearing only the distant rumble of thunder outside as gray clouds swallowed the afternoon sun. "My mother." Ethan frowned. "That is impossible. She found it after the River Ashcroft Bridge collapsed 22 years ago." The color drained from Ethan's face so quickly that even his assistant stepped backward. Nobody outside his closest family had ever mentioned that bridge in public. The investigation files had been sealed. The newspapers had forgotten. Yet this quiet librarian had spoken the place without hesitation. Ethan looked around the library as if someone were playing a cruel trick on him. No cameras. No reporters. Only strangers pretending not to listen. Naomi spoke again, softer now. "She made me promise that one day I would return it to the man who stopped searching before the diary ever stopped waiting." Ethan's heartbeat pounded so loudly he barely heard the rain begin tapping against the enormous glass windows. He slowly opened the weathered cover. Before he could read a single word, something thin and yellowed slipped from between the pages and drifted onto the polished marble floor. Naomi's eyes widened. Ethan froze. It was a sealed envelope with his full name written across the front in handwriting he recognized instantly. Handwriting that had supposedly disappeared forever the night his 12-year-old daughter vanished. The envelope landed softly on the marble floor, yet the sound seemed to shake the entire library. Ethan Carlyle stared at the familiar handwriting, his pulse roaring louder than the rain now drumming against the towering windows. His fingers hovered above the envelope but refused to touch it. The last time he had seen those looping letters, his daughter Lily had slipped a birthday card beneath his office door before disappearing forever. The memory hit like cold air rushing through an open door. Naomi Brooks quietly bent down and picked up the envelope before the draft could carry it away. She brushed a speck of dust from its corner with extraordinary care, as though protecting something sacred. Ethan reached for it instinctively. She did not pull away, but she did not surrender it either. Their eyes locked. Around them, no one dared whisper. The fluorescent reading lamps cast pale reflections across polished tables while the old radiator hissed softly beneath the windows. Even the security guard remained frozen beside the entrance, one hand resting on his radio without pressing the button. Ethan's assistant finally stepped closer. "Sir, this woman could have fabricated everything. We should contact legal." Ethan did not answer. Naomi looked toward the assistant, her expression calm but unwavering. "If I wanted money, I would have sold the diary years ago." The words settled heavily across the room. Ethan frowned. "Years?" Naomi nodded once. "My mother found it the morning after the bridge collapsed. It was soaked, covered in mud, but she refused to let anyone throw it away." Ethan swallowed hard. "Why did she never come forward?" Naomi lowered her eyes for the first time. "She tried." Silence swallowed the room again. She continued, her voice barely above a whisper. "She was the cleaning supervisor at the temporary rescue center. She told investigators she had recovered a diary from the riverbank. They never listened. They told her she was mistaken. They were too busy interviewing people with expensive lawyers." Ethan felt something twist painfully inside his chest. 22 years ago, he had been surrounded by executives, attorneys, private investigators, helicopters, cameras, and reporters. Yet somehow, nobody had ever mentioned a black woman quietly holding the only thing his daughter had left behind. He looked at Naomi differently now, but shame still wrestled with disbelief. "Why today?" he asked. Naomi's fingers tightened gently around the diary. "Because yesterday, someone checked out the only book my mother ever borrowed." Ethan blinked. "What book?" "A History of the Ashcroft Bridge Disaster." The assistant frowned. "That makes no sense." Naomi ignored him. "Inside that book was an obituary." Ethan's breathing slowed. "Whose obituary?" "My mother's." Her voice cracked for the first time. "She died 3 weeks ago." Ethan stared at her in stunned silence. Rain streaked down the giant windows behind them like silver threads. Naomi took one slow breath before continuing. "The night before she passed away, she finally told me your name." Ethan's eyes drifted back to the envelope. His reflection shimmered faintly across the glossy marble floor beneath his polished shoes. Everything he believed about the investigation, about those endless searches, about the final goodbye he had forced himself to accept, suddenly felt incomplete. Naomi carefully placed the envelope into his trembling hands. "She said your daughter wanted you to read this only after you stopped blaming yourself?" Ethan looked at the faded seal. It had never been broken. His thumb slowly traced the edge, hesitating. Then his expression changed completely. Pressed into the wax was the tiny imprint of Lily's favorite butterfly ring, the ring investigators had sworn was never recovered. Ethan's face drained of color, as one impossible question echoed through his mind. If the ring had been here all along, what else had everyone gotten terribly wrong? Ethan's thumb hovered over the brittle seal, but before he could break it open, his assistant stepped between them. "Do not touch it, sir. It is evidence now." The sharp words sliced through the silence. Several patrons instinctively reached for their phones. Tiny camera lights flickered alive across the reading hall, reflecting off polished brass lamps and the rain-soaked windows. Ethan slowly lowered the envelope, his breathing uneven. Naomi watched the growing circle of curious faces without moving an inch. "You still think I brought this here to deceive you?" she said quietly. The assistant answered before Ethan could. "You appeared out of nowhere with the exact story every grieving billionaire wants to hear." Naomi nodded once, almost sadly. "Then ask yourself why I waited 22 years. No one had an answer. Outside, thunder rolled across the city, rattling the tall glass panels. Inside, the old clock struck 4. Every chime landed like another heartbeat. Ethan finally looked directly at Naomi. "If your mother had this all along, why keep me suffering?" Naomi's eyes glistened, but her voice never shook. "Because she was told if she spoke again, she would lose everything." Ethan frowned. "Who threatened her?" Naomi reached inside her canvas satchel. Instantly the assistant stiffened. "Sir, security." The guard took one cautious step forward. Naomi ignored the tension and slowly removed a worn library folder secured with a faded blue ribbon. She placed it gently on the oak table between them. The ribbon had dark water stains that time had never erased. "These are not my mother's words," Naomi said. "These are copies she made because she knew no one would believe her." Ethan stared at the folder as though it might explode. "Open it," Naomi whispered. His assistant immediately objected. "Absolutely not. We should wait for attorneys." Ethan did not even glance at him. His fingers untied the ribbon. The scent of old paper drifted into the air. Inside were yellowed newspaper clippings, handwritten notes, and photographs curled from age. One picture stopped him cold. It showed the temporary rescue center 2 days after the bridge collapse. Volunteers stood shoulder to shoulder in muddy boots beneath floodlights. Near the edge of the frame was a young black woman holding a silk leather diary against her chest. Standing only a few feet behind her was Ethan himself, surrounded by reporters and state officials. He had been there. He had walked right past her. His breath caught painfully. Naomi watched realization spread across his face. "She tried 3 times to hand it to your team." Ethan's lips parted, but no words came. The assistant grabbed another photograph, studying it with narrowed eyes. "This could be altered." Naomi looked at him calmly. "Film cameras did not edit photographs in 1999. A nervous laugh escaped someone in the crowd before dying almost instantly. The assistant's confidence faltered. Ethan continued turning the pages. Then he froze again. Folded between 2 reports was a yellow visitor badge with his daughter's name written across it in permanent marker. The edges were burned slightly on one corner. Ethan recognized it immediately. It had disappeared the same day she vanished. His hand began to tremble. "This was never recovered," he whispered. Naomi slowly nodded. "There is one more thing." She reached into the folder and removed a small cassette tape sealed inside a clear evidence bag. The faded label carried only one sentence written in blue ink. "For Dad." Ethan stared at the tape as every sound inside the library seemed to disappear. Even the rain outside felt distant now. Then Naomi looked into his eyes and quietly said, "My mother never owned a cassette player, so no one has ever heard what is on it." The clear evidence bag seemed to weigh 100 pounds as Ethan Carlyle lifted the cassette tape into the cold library light. Every phone camera in the room tilted upward. Tiny recording lights blinked like silent witnesses. The whispering crowd pressed closer, shoes scraping softly across polished marble until the security guard raised a trembling hand. "Everyone, please step back." Nobody moved. Ethan's assistant recovered first. "This ends now." He reached for the tape. Naomi Brooks caught the edge of the evidence bag before it left Ethan's hand. Not forcefully. Just enough to stop it. "If you break the chain of custody now," she said calmly, "you may destroy the only voice your daughter ever left behind." The words struck harder than a shout. Ethan's hand froze in midair. His assistant stared at Naomi with open disbelief. "You are a librarian?" "Yes." "Then stop pretending you know criminal evidence." Naomi's eyes never left the cassette. "I do not." She inhaled slowly. "I know archives." The room fell silent again. Rain hammered against the towering windows while the fluorescent lights reflected off the tape's cracked plastic shell. Naomi pointed toward the faded label without touching it. "Look at the adhesive." Ethan leaned closer. One corner had lifted slightly with age. "Someone resealed this bag years after it was stored." His assistant scoffed. "That proves nothing." Naomi continued anyway. "Look at the ink." Ethan narrowed his eyes. The words "for Dad" were deep blue. The evidence number beneath them had faded almost purple. "Different pens," Naomi whispered. "Different years." Several people exchanged uneasy glances. One law student quietly lowered her phone and stepped closer to see. Ethan's breathing grew heavier. "You noticed all of that from across the table?" Naomi nodded. "Because preserving history is my job." His assistant's confidence cracked. Coincidences? Naomi slowly opened the old library folder again and removed a yellow inventory card covered with handwritten accession notes. My mother cataloged flood recovery materials before they disappeared. Ethan took the card. Every line was dated. Every item matched the photographs. Except one. Beside the cassette tape, a second item had been listed. Personal letter. Removed before storage. Ethan looked up sharply. Removed by whom? Naomi quietly turned the card over. A signature covered the back in thick black ink. Ethan's face drained of color. He knew the name immediately. Richard Holloway. The attorney who had managed every legal detail after Lily vanished. The same attorney who had become Ethan's closest advisor for more than 2 decades. His assistant stepped backward. That cannot be right. Naomi finally looked directly at Ethan. You trusted him more than anyone. Ethan could barely breathe. Heat rushed into his face despite the cold air flowing through the vents overhead. The marble floor suddenly felt unsteady beneath his polished shoes. His phone vibrated violently inside his coat pocket. Once. Twice. 3 times. He ignored it. It rang again. The caller identification flashed only one name. Richard Holloway. The room seemed to shrink around him. Ethan slowly answered without taking his eyes off the inventory card. Richard. The voice on the other end sounded unusually tense. Whatever someone just handed you, do not open it. I am on my way. Ethan's heart pounded against his ribs. How do you know where I am? Silence. Only breathing. Then the line went dead. No goodbye. No explanation. Naomi closed her eyes for a brief second. When she opened them again, she looked toward the library entrance. Outside the glass doors, a black luxury sedan had just stopped in the pouring rain. A tall man stepped out carrying a leather briefcase, his silver umbrella barely shielding him from the storm. Ethan stared through the rain-streaked glass, unable to move. Naomi spoke so softly that only he could hear. He came much faster than an innocent man should have. The library doors swung open before anyone could breathe again. Richard Holloway stepped inside with rain dripping from the edge of his black umbrella, his polished shoes clicking across the marble floor in slow, measured rhythm. Every phone camera turned toward him. Every whisper died. Ethan Carlyle stood frozen, the unopened cassette in one trembling hand and the inventory card in the other. Richard offered the same calm smile that had reassured judges, senators, and billion-dollar clients for decades. Ethan, he said evenly, put those items down. They have been manipulated. Naomi Brooks looked directly at him for the first time. You came faster than the police. Richard barely acknowledged her existence. And you are? The dismissal landed like a slap. Several people lowered their eyes, expecting Naomi to shrink back. She did not. The librarian your investigators ignored 22 years ago. Richard chuckled softly. No. You are the daughter of someone who misunderstood a tragedy. Ethan finally found his voice. Did you remove a letter from the evidence? Richard's expression did not change. Absolutely not. Naomi quietly slid another photograph across the oak table. Then explain this. Richard glanced down for only a fraction of a second, but it was enough. His pupils tightened. The photograph showed the temporary evidence room after the bridge disaster. Boxes covered every table. Richard stood in the center wearing latex gloves. Behind him, almost hidden in the shadows, rested the exact cassette tape now sitting in Ethan's hand. But something else caught Ethan's eye. A cream-colored envelope rested beside it, sealed with the same butterfly wax mark. Richard immediately looked away. A meaningless photograph. Naomi shook her head. Not meaningless. She pointed toward the corner of the image. Look at the wall clock. Ethan leaned closer. The clock read 9:17. Naomi placed the inventory card beside it. The evidence log says the envelope disappeared at 8:41. Silence crashed over the room. Richard's jaw tightened. Those timestamps could be wrong. Naomi answered immediately. Film cameras recorded the time manually. Your own handwriting corrected it afterward. Ethan stared from the photograph to the inventory card, then back again. His breathing became shallow. Richard stepped closer, lowering his voice. Ethan, grief makes intelligent people vulnerable. Do not let strangers rewrite your memories. Ethan looked up slowly. She has shown me more proof in 20 minutes than anyone has shown me in 22 years. Richard's smile disappeared. Around them, the crowd no longer looked at Naomi with suspicion. They looked at Richard. The security guard subtly moved closer to the entrance. Even Ethan's assistant remained silent, uncertainty replacing confidence. Then Naomi noticed something no one else had seen. Richard's leather briefcase was dripping. Not rainwater. A thin ribbon of dark brown liquid trickled from one corner onto the marble floor. Naomi's eyes narrowed. Your briefcase. Richard instinctively pulled it behind his leg. Too late. The smell reached her first. Damp paper. Mold. River mud. Naomi spoke almost in a whisper. That is not rain. Ethan stared at the briefcase. Open it. Richard did not move. Open it. Ethan repeated louder this time. The entire library seemed to stop breathing. Richard gripped the handle so tightly that the veins in his hands stood out beneath his skin. His polished composure cracked for the first time. A single drop of muddy water hit the marble with a soft tap. Then another. Naomi took one careful step forward. There are still things from the river inside, are there not? Richard's breathing quickened. Without another word, he turned sharply toward the exit. At that exact moment, a deafening electronic chirp echoed from inside the briefcase. Every head turned. Richard closed his eyes for one devastating second. Ethan whispered, almost unable to recognize his own voice. That is Lily's emergency locator. The shrill electronic chirp echoed once more, then faded into a silence so complete that even the rain outside seemed to stop. Richard Holloway remained frozen beside the library doors, his hands still gripping the soaked leather briefcase. No one spoke. The only sound left was Ethan Carlyle's slow, uneven breathing. Naomi Brooks did not rush forward. She did not accuse anyone. She simply watched the briefcase as though it had already told her everything she needed to know. The fluorescent lights reflected across the wet marble floor, catching tiny droplets of muddy water spreading beneath Richard's polished shoes. Somewhere near the entrance, a cell phone vibrated softly against a wooden table before falling quiet again. The crowd no longer looked at Naomi with suspicion. Their eyes had shifted completely. Richard noticed it too. His shoulders remained straight, but the confidence that had filled every room for 30 years was beginning to disappear. Ethan took one careful step closer. Why would Lily's emergency locator be inside your briefcase? Richard swallowed before answering. Because someone planted it. His voice sounded controlled, but not convincing. Naomi quietly shook her head. No. Richard looked at her sharply. You have no idea what you are talking about. Naomi's expression never changed. Actually, I think I do. Ethan turned toward her. The room followed his gaze. Naomi slowly walked toward the reference desk where the old diary still rested beneath the reading lamp. She carefully lifted it, not opening it this time, only feeling its weight with both hands. When books survive floods, she said softly, they leave traces. Richard frowned. This is absurd. Naomi ignored him. Paper remembers water differently than leather. She looked down at the worn cover. This diary dried naturally. Then her eyes moved toward the dripping briefcase. But whatever is inside that case, she paused, was soaked recently. Nobody breathed. Richard instinctively tightened his grip. Ethan stared at the muddy drops forming a thin line across the marble. Naomi continued in the same calm voice. Old river mud turns gray after 2 decades. She looked directly at Richard. Fresh river mud stays brown. Richard's face remained expressionless, but a single muscle twitched near his jaw. The security guard quietly reached for his radio without taking his eyes off the briefcase. Ethan whispered, almost to himself. Fresh. Naomi nodded. Someone has been back to the river. The words settled over the room with terrifying weight. Outside, distant thunder rolled across the skyline. Inside, the old ventilation system hummed softly before shutting off for its evening cycle. The sudden stillness made every heartbeat feel louder. Ethan slowly lowered his eyes to the inventory card still resting in his hand. 22 years. Thousands of employees. Investigators. Divers. Detectives. Lawyers. Yet the first person to notice the difference between old mud and fresh mud had been the quiet black librarian everyone dismissed only an hour earlier. His breathing steadied. Not because he felt safer, but because he finally understood he had been listening to the wrong people for decades. Richard saw that realization spreading across Ethan's face, and for the first time genuine fear entered his own eyes. His phone vibrated inside his jacket. He did not answer. It vibrated again. Then again. The screen lit through the fabric just enough for Naomi to notice one word before the display went dark. Storage. She slowly raised her eyes toward Richard. Someone is waiting for you. Richard said nothing. Ethan followed Naomi's gaze, then looked back at the soaked briefcase. Open it, he said quietly. Richard remained motionless. No excuses. No arguments. Only silence. Naomi watched him for another long second before speaking almost in a whisper. You are afraid of what is inside. Richard finally smiled again, but the smile never reached his eyes. No, he replied. I am afraid of what is still out there. The library fell silent once more. Even the crowd stopped recording. Then, from somewhere deep inside the briefcase, the emergency locator chirped again, followed immediately by the faint sound of a little girl's recorded voice saying only one word. Daddy. The little girl's voice faded into silence, but nobody in the library moved. Ethan Carlyle stood frozen, staring at the soaked briefcase as though time itself had stopped. The fluorescent lights reflected across his tear-filled eyes while dozens of phone cameras continued recording without a single whisper. Richard Holloway slowly tightened his grip on the handle. For the first time in 22 years, he looked like a man who no longer controlled the room. Naomi Brooks remained perfectly still. Her breathing was calm. Her hands rested lightly against the old diary as if she were standing beside an old friend instead of the center of a public storm. Ethan looked toward her, his voice barely audible. How did you know? Naomi answered without looking away from Richard. Because the locator did not activate by accident. Richard laughed once, but it sounded strained. You expect everyone here to believe a librarian understands emergency transmitters? Naomi nodded gently. No. She reached into the diary and carefully unfolded a brittle piece of paper hidden inside the back cover. I expect them to believe Lily. Ethan frowned as Naomi held the faded page beneath the reading lamp. It was not another letter. It was a simple hand-drawn map in colored pencil. Blue lines marked the river. A small butterfly had been drawn beside one location. Ethan's breathing caught instantly. She drew maps everywhere, he whispered. Naomi slowly turned the page over. On the back, written in a child's careful handwriting, were 8 simple words. If Daddy gets this, follow the butterfly. A ripple spread through the crowd. Someone quietly lowered their phone. Another wiped tears from their eyes. Richard's expression hardened. Children imagine things. Naomi finally looked directly at him. Not directions. Ethan stepped closer to the map. His hands trembled as he traced the butterfly symbol with one finger. Suddenly his eyes widened. The butterfly garden. Naomi nodded. The city built it 5 years after the flood. Ethan looked up sharply. On the old riverbank. Naomi answered with quiet certainty. Exactly where your daughter marked this drawing. Richard immediately interrupted. Coincidence. Naomi calmly shook her head. Then explain why your phone kept receiving calls labeled storage. The room fell silent again. Richard said nothing. Ethan slowly turned toward his former attorney. Answer her. Richard remained still. His polished confidence had vanished completely. Naomi continued before he could recover. My mother believed the evidence was moved before investigators arrived. She wrote one sentence over and over in her notebook. Naomi reached into the library folder and removed another yellow page. The handwriting was shaky but unmistakably deliberate. People hide things where nobody looks anymore. Ethan stared at the sentence as though it had been written directly to him. 22 years of boardrooms, legal briefings, and expensive investigations had searched databases, warehouses, and court records. Nobody had searched a public garden built over forgotten ground. Ethan slowly lowered his head. All this time. His voice broke. She was trying to show me. Naomi stepped beside him, not in front of him. Never above him. She still is. Those 4 words changed everything. The crowd no longer saw a quiet black librarian defending an impossible story. They saw the only person who had connected every forgotten detail everyone else had dismissed. Even Ethan's assistant quietly slipped his company identification badge into his pocket, suddenly ashamed of every assumption he had made that afternoon. Richard glanced toward the entrance. Not toward Ethan. Not toward Naomi. Toward the rain outside. Toward escape. The security guard noticed the movement and quietly positioned himself between Richard and the doors. Ethan looked at Richard one final time. Were you protecting me? He paused, fighting to breathe. Or protecting yourself? Richard closed his eyes for one long second. When he opened them again, there was no arrogance left. Only exhaustion. Then, without answering, he slowly reached into his soaked coat and pulled out a small brass key with a faded butterfly engraved on its surface. Every person in the library watched in absolute silence as he placed the key on top of Lily's hand-drawn map. Naomi's face remained calm, but her eyes fixed on the tiny engraved number beneath the butterfly. Locker 317. The tiny brass key rested on Lily's hand-drawn map like the final missing piece of a puzzle no one believed could ever be solved. Nobody reached for it. Nobody even breathed. The cold white lights above reflected across its worn butterfly engraving while dozens of phone cameras captured the impossible silence. Ethan Carlyle stared at the number stamped beneath it. Locker 317. His lips trembled, but no words came. 22 years of endless meetings, expensive investigations, and carefully rehearsed press statements suddenly felt hollow against one forgotten key placed quietly on an old library table. Richard Holloway lowered his head for the first time since entering the building. The room watched the man who had once controlled every conversation become painfully small without anyone raising a voice. Naomi Brooks remained exactly where she had been from the beginning, one hand resting gently on the weathered diary. She neither smiled nor celebrated. Her eyes stayed on Ethan, not with triumph, but with quiet compassion. Ethan slowly turned toward her. His expensive suit, his authority, his reputation, everything that had always filled the room now seemed insignificant beside the woman everyone had dismissed only an hour earlier. I accused you, he whispered. Naomi answered softly. You were hurting. Ethan shook his head. No. His voice cracked. I was judging. The words echoed through the reading hall more heavily than any accusation. Several people lowered their phones. One elderly patron quietly wiped tears from her cheeks. Ethan's assistant stared at the marble floor, unable to meet Naomi's eyes. He remembered every dismissive glance, every skeptical remark, every assumption he had made the moment he saw a black librarian standing behind a circulation desk holding an old diary. None of them could be taken back. Ethan slowly stepped closer until only the library table separated them. For 22 years, he said, I trusted titles, offices, credentials, and people who looked powerful. His eyes filled again. The only person who actually protected my daughter's voice was someone nobody bothered to hear. Naomi's expression remained calm. My mother always said history disappears twice. Ethan looked at her. Twice? The first time when it happens. She glanced at the diary. The second time when people decide whose story matters. Nobody interrupted. Even Richard remained silent. The words settled over the crowd with quiet force. Ethan looked around the library. Moments earlier, strangers had watched Naomi with suspicion. Now they looked at her with something entirely different. Respect. Gratitude. Regret. A little girl who had been hiding behind her father's legs slowly walked toward Naomi carrying a library book against her chest. Without saying a word, she offered the book to Naomi with both hands. Naomi smiled gently and accepted it before kneeling to straighten the child's bent bookmark. The tiny gesture somehow moved the room more deeply than anything else that afternoon. Ethan watched in silence, realizing that the same steady kindness Naomi had shown a frightened child was the kindness she had shown him despite every harsh word he had thrown at her. Richard quietly removed his attorney identification badge and placed it beside the brass key. Nobody asked him to. Nobody applauded. The gesture spoke for itself. Outside, the rain began to soften, and pale evening light filtered through the towering windows, warming the old wooden shelves for the first time that day. Ethan carefully picked up the butterfly key with both hands, as though it belonged to someone far more important than himself. Then he looked back at Naomi. "Will you come with me?" Naomi hesitated only briefly before answering. "Not because you are asking." Ethan nodded slowly, understanding before she finished. "Because Lily deserves to be found." Naomi gave a quiet nod. Together they turned toward the library doors. Behind them, no one spoke. No one rushed to follow. Every person simply watched as the billionaire who had entered believing he had all the answers walked out beside the librarian he had once dismissed. Just before they reached the exit, Naomi stopped. Her eyes settled on the old diary still resting alone beneath the reading lamp. Something about it felt unfinished. Ethan noticed her expression. "What is it?" Naomi looked at the worn leather cover, now glowing softly beneath the fading light. "We never opened the last page." Naomi Brooks slowly reached for the weathered diary once more. The library had grown almost completely still. The phones that had recorded every accusation now hung quietly at people's sides. Outside, the rain had stopped. A warm band of evening light slipped through the tall windows, stretching across the old oak table until it rested against the faded leather cover. Ethan Carlyle stood beside her without speaking. He no longer stood in front of her. He no longer stood above her. He simply waited. Naomi carefully opened the diary to its final page. The brittle paper whispered beneath her fingertips. There were no long entries. No hidden confession. Only one sentence written in Lily's careful handwriting beneath another tiny butterfly. "Someday, someone kind will bring this home." Ethan closed his eyes. His shoulders trembled once before becoming still. He realized the words had never been about the diary alone. They were about hope surviving longer than grief. Naomi gently turned the diary toward him. "She was waiting for you," she said softly. Ethan looked at her for a long moment before answering. "No." His voice was quiet now, stripped of pride and certainty. "She was waiting for you." Around them, nobody interrupted. Even Richard Holloway remained silent, his eyes fixed on the floor as though the weight of 22 years had finally settled where it belonged. The security guard quietly stepped aside. The invisible barrier that had once separated Naomi from everyone else had disappeared without anyone noticing the exact moment it happened. Ethan carefully folded the diary closed. Then, in front of every witness, he placed it back into Naomi's hands. Not because it belonged to the library. Because he believed it was safest there. The gesture changed the room more deeply than any apology could have. His assistant slowly approached Naomi, unable to hide the regret in his eyes. "I should have listened." Naomi offered a small, tired smile. "You can start now." No bitterness. No triumph. Only grace. A few patrons quietly applauded, but the sound faded almost immediately, as though everyone understood that silence honored the moment better than celebration ever could. The little girl who had returned her book earlier looked up at Naomi again. "Will the story have a happy ending?" Naomi glanced toward Ethan. He was holding the butterfly key close to his heart, but this time his head was lifted instead of bowed. Some stories, she answered gently, find their ending when someone finally believes the truth. The child smiled and walked away. Evening settled over the library. The fluorescent lights clicked off one row at a time until only the golden lamps above the reading tables remained. Ethan paused at the doorway and looked back. Tomorrow, he said quietly, we go to locker 317. Naomi nodded. Tomorrow. He left without another word. The echo of his footsteps faded into the cooling evening air. Naomi remained alone among the shelves, returning the diary to its place with the same care she gave every forgotten story that entered her library. As she slid it onto the shelf, a single ray of sunset caught the small brass butterfly embossed on its spine, making it glow for just an instant before the light disappeared. The library became silent again. Not with loneliness. With peace. And for the first time in 22 years, the most powerful man in the room had walked away carrying humility, while the quiet black librarian remained exactly where she had always been, faithfully protecting stories until the world was finally ready to hear them.